How might we, as embodied beings, cultivate a connection with the wider socio-ecological environment in which we are inescapably embedded? This question is not only significant for both 4E cognition in various religious movements, but also for addressing the climate crisis, which directly confronts our environmental embeddedness. Many nature religions, such as Wicca, provide cognitive frameworks and structured practices which foster an immersive connection between body minds and their environment. Here, we will explore Wiccan practice's role in promoting nature connectedness and identification. We will investigate two key cognitive strategies which enable this: conceptually blending nature and the body, and practices of enactive sense making embedded in ecological settings. Additionally, we will explore how engagement with environmentalist activities is subsequently promoted by cultivating nature connectedness and identity in an embodied, embedded, and enacted fashion. Rooted in late modern conceptions of magic and post war interest in nature religions, Wicca arose in the UK in the 1950s through the writings of Gerald Gardner and Doreen Valiente, growing to become a foundational movement within contemporary paganism. Wiccan theory and practice is greatly diverse, composing a vast array of lineages, philosophies, and interpretations. While the ideas discussed here are intended to apply broadly across Wicca, I will be drawing primarily upon ecofeminist conceptions, articulated by authors such as Carol P. Christ and especially Starhawk. In her foundational text, The Spiral Dance, Starhawk describes Wicca as a religion of ecology whose goal is harmony with nature. A central component of this religion of ecology is the personification of nature through deities, such as the Green Man or the Great Mother Goddess. These deities allow practitioners to envision and abstract nature in embodied terms, offering new means of relating with it. We can understand these personified deifications of nature as a form of conceptual blending. Conceptual blending is a common cognitive practice where conceptual structures from two separate domains are combined to create an emergent third concept with new features. For example, conceptual structures related to biological viruses and computer code are combined into the blend of a computer virus, a concept which intuitively communicates software that infects, replicates, and spreads. Conceptual blend of a nature deity then allows nature to be more easily engaged at a human scale. It does this by integrating the abstract concept of nature with the concrete familiarity of embodied personhood. This blend supports emotional resonance and reciprocity with the complex systems of nature by connecting it to familiar embodied and social cognitive systems. The experience oriented practices of Wicca have been described as facilitating interpretive drift, or a gradual change in perception, patterns of noticing, and meaning making resulting from engagement in embodied ritual practices. Framing nature in embodied terms reshapes the relationships it affords, allowing practitioners to conceptualize their natural embedding in new, embodied ways. To illustrate, some Wiccan rituals frame seasonal processes of cyclical regeneration in bodily terms, describing them through the conception, birth, aging, and death of deities. This shared bodily framing also encourages tangible engagements with an otherwise abstract nature through embodied practice, as embodied nature deities suggest to practitioners that divinity could be as close as their flesh. This closeness can get quite literal. Wiccan ritual frequently immerses practitioners in multisensory engagements, which centralize and sacralize the body. A clear example of this can be observed in the traditional practice within certain Wiccan lineages of performing rituals skyclad, meaning literally clothed by the sky, but practically meaning to lack clothes. In Doreen Valente's classic Wiccan liturgy, Charge of the goddess addresses the practitioner directly, proclaiming, "As a sign that you be free, you shall be naked in your rights." Here, the naked body is presented as something both natural and sacred, making it optimal for ritual connection with embodied nature deities like the goddess. The removal of clothes is then viewed as a thinning of the barrier between embodied self and world, bridging the environment as close to the flesh as possible. Though the literal closeness of skyclad is by no means practiced by all, the use of the body to encounter the environment in new ways remains a common feature across Wiccan practice, allowing connection with nature to be tactically sensed in new, deeply intimate forms. The connection of embodiment and natural embedding can also be found in another foundational motif in Wicca, the four classical elements of air, fire, water, and earth. Central to Wiccan ritual practice, these are understood as a foundational structuring process of both the individual and the environment. These are considered to have both concrete sensory and abstract affective qualities. For example, water's structural fluidity is associated with emotional adaptability and intuition, or Earth's concrete sturdiness with emotional calmness and stability. We can understand these as another conceptual blend between aspects of the environment and affective qualities within the practitioner's emotional landscape. This conceptual blend, like nature deities, then acts as a means to co identify practitioner and environment through their shared participation in the elements. Various practitioner guidebooks contain ritual exercises involving active engagement with natural settings as a means of becoming familiar with the four elements. These exercises help to develop an embodied understanding of the elements through sensory and affective immersion in the environment. For example, we find various practices involving traveling to natural settings, immersing one's feet in earth or water, actively observing its sensations. While tacitly engaged, they meditate on ideas associated with the elements, such as emotional groundedness or fluidity. Coming to understand the elements is thus not achieved by passive contemplation alone, but rather requires active immersion of a body that feels its way through the world, in both the sensory and emotional sense of feeling. In framing nature as embodied through the conceptual blend of nature deities, practices of engaging nature through the body can better foster an immersive connection between individual body minds and their environment. Yet, if both nature and individuals are framed as embodied, critical question arises. Where does one body end and the other begin? If both are body like and individual body minds are inescapably embedded in their environment, this mutual embodiment allows feelings of natural connection to grow into a shared identity with nature, blending the boundary of body mind and environment into an ecological self identity. This relationally embodied connection can be clearly observed in Starhawk's description of the goddess, where she says that the earth is a living being whom we call the goddess. Everything around us is alive and part of her living body. Even though we are separate people, all of us are part of her, just as each of your fingers is part of your hand. Turning to the practices of interacting with the four elements, these not only develop an understanding of the meaning of their symbolic and sensory qualities, but also deepen one's connection to the environments in which these elements manifest. This parallels activities observed in studies highlighting a link between practices of emotional engagement, association of symbolic meaning, and active noticing with increased nature connectedness and identification. Significantly, because the individual and nature have been co identified via a shared framing of embodiment, and the elements have been identified as a shared structuring process, these blends allow for engagements that enact a self identity unpartitioned from its embedding environment. Put simply, these practices allow the enactment of an embodied self identity with nature. To explore the development of these new meanings and identity, we would do well to look to the work of enactivism. Enactive theories locate cognition in the embodied activity of organisms in their environment. Here, meaning and identity co emerge via ongoing exchanges with the environment. Boundaries of organisms, such as bodies, are reinterpreted as being produced by the organizing actions of living in the world, a process called autopoiesis. The identity of this embodied organism is then relationally enacted through ongoing couplings with the environment, where repeated engagements stabilize meaning and identity. To illustrate, the shape of my hand crystallizes millions of years of evolved body environment engagements, where actions like grasping food or tools are necessary for survival. The boundaries of organisms are understood as ever coming into being through the activity of their environmental coupling. Therefore, an organism's identity depends on actively maintaining this boundary through meaningful exchanges with the environment, which both interconnect and distinguish. For example, metabolism maintains the body, which acts as a boundary distinguishing meat from the environment, yet at the same time depends on exchanging nutrients with it. Thus, for an activism, the question, where does one body end and the other begin, dissolves mid bite, as the boundary between an organism and the environment sustaining it is actively being made and remade. This body boundary question is reframed as a dynamic blending of relations, as opposed to a fixed dividing line, where the body is viewed more like an interface than a wall. Through ongoing interaction, an organism maintains itself by making sense of its world. For example, metabolism involves making sense of what is edible and non edible. And activists call this process sense making, an organism's embodied, active, and affect laden regulation of its couplings with the environment. Sense making is intrinsically affective. Our world shows up in value laden ways which guide action. Food sense of edibility, for example, is made through the tongue's coordinating action and shows up qualitatively as food being delicious or disgusting. Here, meaning is not passively received, but rather actively formed by moving, probing, and coordinating through the body. In this way, embodied movements make and morph cognition and meaning as an active loop with the environment. Thus, in an activism, bringing forth a meaningful world and an embodied self identity are two sides of the same coin. As Varela eloquently puts it, organism and environment enfold into each other and unfold from one another in the fundamental circularity that is life itself. How might we apply these ideas to our present concerns? We can understand the previously discussed Wiccan practices as a method of making sense of an embodied ecological self identity. Rituals, such as the elemental exercises, present an active process of meaning and identity making that reorganizes how the body meets the environment. These practices center the role of the body by using conceptual blends like nature deities or the elements. These blends allow for embodied activity as a means of connecting to and identifying with the natural world, forming a relational identity via ecological activity. Through repeated practice, individuals enact both a world saturated with symbolic significance and a self immersed in embodied identity with its environment. Put simply, to achieve connection and co identification between embodied self and an embodied nature, Wiccan practice prescribes embodied activity in and with the environment. Sense making is both an embodied and affective process, and we can observe a clear example of this in the elemental exercises. These make sense of shared structures like water by simultaneously engaging in tactile and emotional activities. For example, by immersing one's feet in water, this practice incorporates tangible, concrete sensations that train sensory motor couplings with the environment. By simultaneously meditating on abstract concepts like emotional fluidity, this practice also sculpts affective couplings. These sensory and affective couplings are then associated through the conceptual blend of the element water. enacting a symbolic bridge between felt sense and environmental embedding. By engaging a self identity interconnected with nature through conceptually blending body and nature, and via activity of the body in nature, these encounters stabilize couplings in a specific manner. The focus on interconnection avoids alienating individuals from their environment, while at the same time, the bodily orientation avoids collapse into an undifferentiated monist state of exclusive focus on either self or environment. These practices then mirror the body environment relation proposed by enactive sensemaking and act as a clear illustration of the identity and meaning making processes it describes. Through emphasis on cultivating nature connection and identification through embodied activity in place, Wicca also commonly encourages environmentalist activity as an embodiment of its spiritual practice. Put simply, by cultivating nature identification through activity in the environment, an identity of activist for the environment may be promoted via conceptual affinity. In the words of Starhawk, if we saw the Earth as our extended body, perhaps we would treat her better. Embodied ritual activity in nature contributing to environmentalism has also been observed in ethnographic work on British eco-pagan protest sites. Here, sustained bodily immersion in place, personification of the land, and ritual within natural environments promoted an experiential reconfiguration where self becomes identified with environment. Through this perceptual and affective reorganization, identification with nature may transmute into lived, embodied activism, where protecting place is perceived as protecting self. The correlation between nature identification and environmentalism is likewise supported by psychological studies proposing these as significant factors in the formation of collective political identities which predict environmentalist activity. A clear example of this identity affinity is Starhawk's text, The Earth Pact, a book devoted to the practical application of Wiccan ideas to environmentalist concerns, complete with specific rituals for activism. Here, she not only encourages practitioners to embrace a shared identity with nature through ritual movements of the body, also to enact this identity through embodied participation in environmentalist movements. On the right, we can see an application of such environmentalist ritual praxis by Asheville's Old and Wild Wiccan Coven in 2007. Wiccan practice helps to cultivate an ecological self identity via conceptual blending of body and nature and embodied interactions with nature. By engaging in sensory and affective laden ritual interactions between body and environment, practitioners reconfigure perception to experience the self as part of a living environment. In this, Wicca provides fertile ground for the investigation of cognitive practices which encourage nature connection and identification, as well as an opportunity to explore how such practices can contribute to a propensity toward environmentalist activity. By centering the body mind's embedding in nature, these practices engage a core tenet of both 4E cognition and environmentalism that we are not so separate from the environment and should proceed accordingly.